It is generally accepted in the trucking industry that trucking companies need truck drivers more than anyone because the truck drivers pull the loads, they get paid for the loads, that's how everybody makes their money. So you would then think it would follow that trucking companies would want to take care of their drivers and handle them with kid gloves because the drivers are the carrier's most valuable asset. So you would think that they would treat them really well and hire a good management team to be the communications between the carrier and their most valuable asset, their drivers. Well, you would think so anyway. Driving Test is the nation's #1 provider of online driving courses, and they have developed a course for professional drivers to help them get their CDL knowledge exam and help them pass their ELDT test. They're fully approved and licensed by the FMCSA. Check them out at drivingtest.org. A couple of years ago, here at Smart Trucking, we did a survey to find out how truck drivers felt about their dispatchers and if their dispatchers were treating them professionally. And it was a disappointing result to the survey, with more than 66% of drivers feeling that their dispatch team was lacking or inadequate. Just recently, we did another poll hoping that those numbers had improved. Sadly, the dispatcher rating had dropped another 4%. So it shows that the trend with dispatchers treating their drivers correctly and properly is on a downhill trend, and we don't want to see that. Now, we know that the big carriers are getting bigger and the mega carriers now are just growing and growing, and their #1 concern is how they handle their people that buy their stocks. Mega carriers that are publicly traded rely on investments from the stock market, and that's where they get their money to pay the CEOs for the huge salaries, and that's where they pay their upper management. And there's all sorts of money there in publicly traded trucking companies. But the problem is most of that money stays at the top of the hill and not enough trickles down to the bottom. So it's one problem that they don't pay their drivers particularly well, but it's another problem altogether, a separate problem, that they don't pay their dispatchers very well, so they hire meatheads to do the dispatching because meatheads are easier to find and they cost less to employ. The problem with having these meathead dispatchers is that they tend not to treat the truck drivers very well. And this in return, the truck drivers recognize this and end up leaving the carrier partially, or in a lot of cases mostly, because their dispatchers are meatheads. This in turn creates this churn, which is called driver turnover, and even big carriers now are starting to get smarter about realizing that having meathead dispatchers is costing them money. And a few years ago they started to call them driver managers. That just made the dispatchers' heads swell even more, and they got even more cocky. I think you ought to go back to calling them dispatchers to keep their heads from swelling up. And when you've got dispatchers that are dispatching owner-operators, for instance, owner-operators have an investment in that company, whereas the dispatchers don't. So when you get a dispatcher that's forced dispatching an owner-operator, that's a serious mistake, and that costs you drivers in turnover. Now, really smart carriers invest in finding good dispatchers. They have a headhunting program to search out good dispatchers because they want to bring good dispatchers to that company, and they know that good dispatchers are often followed by good drivers. So when they get a good dispatcher, good drivers will follow. When they've got a good team like that, the good customers and the money will come. And the word spreads among the trucking industry. So when you've got a good carrier with good dispatchers, drivers tell other drivers that, and good dispatchers attract good drivers, and the whole thing is circular. And that's what you want. My advice to carriers would be, pay your drivers well. Invest in a good dispatch team that communicates well with your head asset, your drivers, and everything else will fall into place. This brings to mind a story from my past. Many, many years ago, I was an owner-operator for this carrier, and I was handing in my paperwork and leaving the building one day, and I went out the exit, and there were a couple of women that worked upstairs, and they were talking away, and I couldn't help but overhear them as I passed by, and the one was saying to the other, "This would be a good place to work if it weren't for all those truck drivers." And I stopped in my tracks, and I thought about turning around and saying something, and I thought, I better just shut my mouth and keep going. But it was a reflection of the culture at that company, that those people in upper management didn't recognize the value of the drivers. Without the truck drivers, there was no company. I thought it was kind of a funny story when I thought back on it later. At the time I was mad, but does anybody think that I didn't share that story with a few other drivers there? You bet I did. Take care, keep the rubber side down. Remember, drivers are what makes the world go round. Stay safe, I'll see you on the backhaul.